Howdy, folks. It's Miss Sinclair for Miss Sinclair's history class. Today, we are continuing on to period two. Period two looks at the European colonization of the Americas between 1607 and 1754. And from here on out, we are basically just looking at the British colonies. So before we jump into that, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who have listened to these or watched these videos. If you are watching this on YouTube or listening to this as a podcast, you are getting the exact same lecture that my students get in class. I create these as a resource for students who are taking the class, who might be doing it as a self-study, who maybe are absent. I know that sometimes illness or sports means you miss class, and it's really hard to make that up for your AP classes. So I'm hoping this can be helpful to you. Or maybe you're a teacher who's teaching APUSH for the first time, or you're an adult who just wants to know, what are the kids learning in US history these days? This is what the kids are learning. Maybe you just want a refresher of US history yourself. Either way, I am glad you're here. Please do leave a rating or review or subscribe. I know it's the cliche thing to say, but I really do appreciate it. It helps make this more available for students, spreads the word. So enough of me talking, let's jump into it. We are going to start looking at the different British colonies in the US. Well, at the time it wasn't the US, but we'll get to there eventually. So this is topic 2.3 of the AP curriculum, looking at the different regions of British colonies. Let's jump into it. So I want you to think back, see what you remember. What were some of the similarities and differences between the Spanish, French, and Dutch colonies in the New World? There are some ways they are similar and some that they are different. The reason why I always start my lectures with a question is to activate your own learning. What do you already know? What do you remember? How much did you forget? So often students just think, I sat through class, I learned it. I don't need to read over my notes. I don't need to read the textbook. I've got it. Great. If you've got it, you should be able to answer this question. If you're struggling, okay, maybe use this as a self-assessment tool. Maybe you need to read over your notes at night, read the textbook, get a review book. Use these questions as a way to gauge your own learning. How much are you actually absorbing? So I can answer this for you. Some of the similarities, well, the Spanish and the French both were interested in spreading Catholicism, although the Spanish were much more interested. The Dutch had religious freedom in New Amsterdam. The Dutch and the French were much more interested in economic partnerships with indigenous peoples, whereas the Spanish enslaved them. All of them had this certain level of ethnocentrism, and all of them used waterways to help navigate and claim land. So we're going to start by looking at the Chesapeake colonies, right? You will definitely hear terms like New England colonies, middle colonies, southern colonies in your textbook from your teacher. And there's a reason for that. These different regions have different characteristics, and we're starting in the middle. So you will be able to explain how and why environmental and other factors shape the development and expansion of the Chesapeake colonies between 1607 and 1754. So let's think a little bit about what would motivate English migration at all. I've taught AP Human Geography for years and years and years. And in Unit 2 of AP Human Geo, we spend a lot of time talking about migration, specifically push and pull factors. A push factor is something that would push you out of your home. A pull factor is something that would pull you to a new place. So what were some of the push and pull factors for English migrants to the New World? Well, at first, it was difficult to convince people to go. The British population had mushroomed thanks to new foods from the American colonies. right? We have fewer children dying. We have more babies being carried to term. It means population is going up. Fewer people are starving to death. This is ultimately a good thing, but it's going to create a lot of political and social pressure, especially as you start to see landlords pushing peasants off their land. Land is being consolidated by nobles. One of the reasons that this is significant is because in England and much of Europe, you have a policy custom known as primogeniture, which essentially means the firstborn boy gets everything, right? So the firstborn son receives all the land, all the wealth. Great. Well, what if you're a second-born son or a third-born daughter? Well, tough luck. I guess you can join the army or join the church. So this new land in England, or this new land in America, is going to be very appealing for these later born sons who are now actually like living to adulthood. There's also a desire to catch up with Spain. We definitely feel like we have fallen behind in terms of the sort of colonial space race. Yeah, Spain got a head start, and England is coming up last right now. So our second attempt at a colony in the New World is Jamestown. Remember, our first attempt was Roanoke, which was a failure. Jamestown was initially built to be a fort against Spain. The Virginia Joint Stock Company is going to fund this initial colonization. It's a 5-month trip across the Atlantic Ocean. 104 men will land in the New World. They are all from London. They are going to land in territory controlled by the Potawatomi people. Potawatomi is in charge of several tribes. This area of Jamestown is already settled. There are several villages. There's, and again, I'd like to apologize for any mispronunciations I might have. You have Panuke, Rappahannock, Nipmunks. There's about 15,000 different peoples in the Potawatomi Confederacy. And these different tribes have are similar, socially and politically similar in many ways. In many ways, this confederacy is sort of similar to Southwestern civilizations. So Jamestown will be settled 35 miles upriver because they want to make sure they're getting fresh water, right? The Chesapeake Bay, of course, is saltwater, and they want fresh water to drink. All right. There's a reason why no one was living on this little corner of land. They're sort of the last buyer in the subdivision. It's the worst place possible. There's a reason why all the indigenous peoples were not living on this corner. It's an incredibly swampy area to begin with. Lots of mosquitoes, so malaria is going to be a huge problem. The second thing is they misunderstood the geography. These first wave of settlers didn't understand how far upriver the Chesapeake Bay tides went, right? So when you settle on a river, you get your fresh water upstream and you dump your bodily fluids, your poop and your pee, downstream. That way, you are always getting clean water. You know that, like, all right, everything is being washed away. So we are getting our water above where our poop goes. That works great, unless the tides come in way further than you expect and push all of your human refuse back upstream. So dysentery is going to be a huge impact. They're all going to die of dysentery, which is a gross way to die. Like, it really is just like, first of all, you get it from drinking poop water. Then it just causes you to barf and have diarrhea, which creates more poop water. Like, it's just gross. By September, 60 of the 104 people are dead. This is the wrong kind of settler, right? They brought city folks. They brought merchants, middle-class people who didn't want to work. Like, you hire people to build things. Imagine if you brought, Moira and David and that whole family from Schitt's Creek, right? Um, they don't know how to build a fort. They're not going to get their hands dirty in farming, right? This is the kind of people that they brought. They brought things like outfits. They didn't bring useful tools like saws and axes. They lacked supplies. They ate and drank what they did bring very quickly. They would refuse to hunt or fish because it's below them. Thank you very much. Right? At this point in the Chesapeake Bay, you have 14-foot long sturgeons, these fish, like they could be eating well. They are going to be dying from starvation. It's called the starving time. They're dying from malaria. Jamestown's basically a death trap. Settlers will be reduced to eating dogs, horses, cats, snakes, anything they can get. And we see evidence that they dug up corpses and ate them. Not a great first, or rather second attempt for the British colonizers. Enter one, John Smith. Now, John Smith, not nearly so glamorous as the Disney movie would make him out to be in general. That movie turns out not very historically accurate. He's essentially a merchant warrior in a lot of ways, right? He has traveled, he has done trade all around the world. He's also fought for his life several times, and he's not afraid to work. So basically, he gets there, looks at this mess, and says, this isn't working for me. I'm now in charge, and you will either work or you will die. Like, those are your options. And they're like, no, I don't want to work. It's beneath me. Great. You don't get food. We'll leave you out there with the poop water to die. No, you don't want to starve to death? Great. Here's a shovel. Start digging. Virginia is really saved by the leadership of intrepid John Smith. He threatened to kill people who didn't work. Great. You're not going to work? Cool. Well, we don't want to wait for you to die. So why don't you just like line up? I'm going to get the gun and I'll just execute you now. It'll be faster. Don't worry. Right. He fought in Russia, Turkey, Asia, and he is going to lie his little butt off in letters back to England. He knows he has to sell this place. He describes Virginia as a Garden of Eden, creates a Journal of New England to try and attract more people to migrate to Jamestown. Despite this, death reaps a gruesome harvest. By 1625, only 1,200 of the initial survivors had, only 1,200 of the initial settlers had survived. 8,000 had ultimately come over, right? That is a terrible survival rate. So we need more people coming over. Well, they're going to start bringing over indentured servants. Indentured servitude is going to play a really important role in the middle colonies to begin with. An indentured servant essentially is like, it's similar to a slave in a lot of ways, but for a set period of time. I will work for you for 7 years. You will pay my way over to get to the New World. You will give me a place to live and food to eat, and I will work for you for 7 years. And then I'm home free. Then I'm a free man. I am independent. I can get some land. I can make a way of my own. It was especially hard for women who did this, but it was one of the ways that they brought people over. So what about the relationship with the indigenous people? Well, you had a uneasy truce. Smith will be captured by the Padawans, threatened with death. Enter Pocahontas. Pocahontas is the daughter of the chief. She says that they should ally with the colonists against other indigenous enemies, right? So at first, the colonists aren't necessarily viewed as an enemy. They could be an ally against your other indigenous enemies, right? The other native peoples. So they will adopt Smith. They had no romantic relationship. It was a ritual adoption, brother-sister relationship. Pocahontas, in fact, marries John Rolfe, a different Englishman. And this alliance produces a golden age for Jamestown. The Potawatomi people will produce supplies for Jamestown, but then John Smith returns to England. Why? Two different stories that history has. Maybe he was wounded, right, and has to return to England for healthcare. Or everyone hated him because he was like work or die and was such a hard ass that he was recalled to England. They kicked him out. So I recommend, if you get a chance, watch this song Savages from the movie Pocahontas. It gives a good example of how history is interpretation. I don't know if I've said this phrase yet, but if I haven't, this is basically the thesis of my class. History is interpretation. There are different ways to interpret historical events, different ways to interpret actions, right? And this silly Disney movie really illustrates that. This song shows how both the Englishmen and the native people viewed the other as savage because they didn't understand them. They viewed them as enemies. So without sort of a link, we will see that this prevailing view will become dominant. So John Smith goes back and things start to break down. Relationships sour. So we see Jamestown will ultimately become a tobacco company. It will change its goals, right? They realize there's not gold here. Instead, they discover a very handy little thing called tobacco. John Rolfe is going to sort of represent this. He will introduce tobacco to Virginia. He will also marry Pocahontas. He takes her back to England. She dies there. It's kind of sad. So this is a tobacco that's easy to smoke. It feels nice. And it is a bewitching weed, as it's nicknamed. They will quickly grow thousands of pounds of tobacco to get money. By 1624, 1.5 million pounds of tobacco are being grown. By 1700, you're growing 40 million pounds of tobacco per year. This will cause political change, social change, change in economic styles. It's a big deal, right? They quickly realize indentured servitude is not providing us enough labor. So in 1619, our first African slaves arrive in the British colonies. By 1624, even though King James, not a fan of tobacco, decides that the profit is too great and converts Jamestown to a royal colony. So we see that the headright system will be introduced to try and attract labor as well. So you get 50 acres of land if you settle it and grow tobacco. We realize that we need women, right? Our average settler in the Virginia colony at first was a 17 to 20-year-old white male, and they're constantly fighting with each other. So the Virginia company is like, we should bring women over. This will cause them to settle down. And it does help sort of create a more family atmosphere instead of just a male one, but it's still going to be very male dominant. African slaves are first introduced, like I said, in 1619, but slavery will be firmly established by 1662. So we're the white indentured servants, were the white settlers in Virginia already racist, or did they become racist when slaves arrived? And there's different historical interpretations of this. You know, racism is often learned as indentured servants want to establish their role in the social hierarchies to say that they are better than above the Black slaves that they are working side by side with. They become more racist. We'll talk a lot more about American slavery, so I'm just going to pause that there. Let's think instead about what you know. Without looking at your notes, see, can you identify 3 challenges Jamestown experienced? Can you remember off the top of your head, what are 3 challenges Jamestown has experienced? Food, disease, a misunderstanding of the geography. So things break down. We see that Padawan, the leader, has died. His brother, I apologize again for these names, Open Chanawago attacks because he thinks that this partnership with the English is a bad idea. Kills 25% of Jamestown. But ultimately, the natives will be outnumbered and weak from disease. So they are going to be unable to kick the English out. Instead, we see more and more British people arriving. In 1619, we see our first political system really being established, the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is a representative government. Burgess means common, ordinary man. So landowners in England can vote. You need just 3 acres of land to be eligible to vote. Well, they bring over these same rules to Virginia. If you need 3 acres of land to vote in England, that means about 10% of Englishmen can vote. In Virginia, though, many people own land. So in fact, 90% of men can vote. That's a huge difference. It's going to mean that the way that these new Americans, right, these British colonists in the New World conceive of their rights and their participation in government is going to be very different than that of your common Englishman. We start to see sociological change as well, right? When you arrive in England or arrive in Virginia, you experience the seasoning time. Basically, your first year in the New World is so difficult. If you survive this seasoning time, you're good, like you're going to make it. So they start to make some changes to help people survive. They dig wells instead of getting water from the river. They start to make alcohol, Applejack. Hey, doesn't have poop in it. They start to grow cotton. So that means people aren't dying from polluted water. Applejack is made from boiled water and has a low level of alcohol in it. Wool is terrible in Virginia because it's hot. Cotton can be washed. Cotton is more breathable. So you start to see the rise of plantations and aristocracy. As families claim more and more land, they start to consolidate that land into plantations, right? You have William Byrd Westover, who was the second richest man in England. But in Virginia, you have 42 different plantation owners who rule Virginia, who have so much land, right? So as people are forced to go further and further west to get their land, right? As families consolidate, the land is less viable. It is more mountainous. It is more rocky. We'll talk about this tension between the rich landowners and the poor people who desire land and how it contributes to Bacon's Rebellion a little bit later. What about families? What about women? Well, women were first really introduced in Virginia to cause men to straighten up, stop getting drunk, stop fighting so much. And families will have a rough go of it. The mortality rate for children is about 50%. That's really hard, that half of your children will die. We also see that families will have domesticated animals like cattle and pigs, but these animals will be allowed to freely roam since you don't have any sort of fences established. These animals will then wander into Indian farmland, eating and trampling their corn and their food. This increases tensions. The Anglican Church, which is the Church of England, it's the Protestant Church of England, is going to be established in Virginia, right? It's the official church of Virginia. So St. Luke's is going to be the first church built in 1630. Because it is the official church of the colony, the priests are paid by the government. And so it's these Anglican ministers who will establish schools. It's not very many people needed school or wanted school. All right, well, what about Maryland, another Chesapeake colony? Well, Maryland is gifted, it's a proprietary colony, and it is gifted to Lord Calvert of Baltimore, who was a friend of Charles I. King Charles I was secretly sympathetic towards Catholicism. So he was gifted this land to be a sanctuary for Catholics. Since it was a proprietary colony, Lord Baltimore could sell, lease, give away land, appoint public officials, form churches. So in 1649, he will pass the Toleration Act, which says anyone who believes in Jesus can come, right? Protestants are welcome, but so are Catholics. Jews are not. And by 1670, though, they are starting to restrict voting to any white man with more than 50 acres. 3 acres is giving us a little bit too much democracy. So I always encourage watching these crash course videos. It provides a different perspective. They provide different resources, and it's worth checking out. So how did the tobacco economy draw the Chesapeake colonies into the greater Atlantic world? What role did tobacco play? It basically brought the Chesapeake colonies into the global economy. All right, we're going to stop here actually, because it would be either one insanely long lecture. So I'm going to let us do 3 shorter ones. Next, we'll be talking about New England, but for now, we're going to stop. Instead, I want you to think about how and why did environmental and other factors shape the development and expansion of the Chesapeake colonies?